now that we've learned all about the provider package, it's time to actually put it into action in our app so that we can read the tasks that are stored, we can add new tasks, we can check tasks off, and we can delete tasks when the user desires it. So in this first part of putting provider into practice, we're going to tackle the first goal, which is to be able to get the tasks and to be able to use it both on the task screen as well as the task list. Essentially, we're going to keep the state of our task provider high so that we can use it all the way down the tree. And we're going to be providing that data both to the task screen as well as the task list, and they're going to listen for changes in the task data. On the task screen, the reason why we need it is because we have this little part where it says 12 tasks. That number has to be dynamic and reflect all the tasks that are currently inside our to-do list. And for the task list, well, that's pretty self-explanatory. We need the task data available there so that we can actually render this list of tasks. Now, in the coming lessons where we're implementing provider, I'm going to explain exactly what behavior we need first up front, and then you have the choice of either completing it as a challenge or simply following along with me. But I recommend that you really give it a go yourself, and even if you get stuck and come back, you will learn a lot more than simply just following along. So in this case, what we need to be able to do is to use our ChangeNotifier provider to provide our tasks data right at the top of our app, at the very root of our widget tree, and then we can listen for it inside the task screen to update that number, as well as inside our task list to update the list of task tiles. So once you're ready, open up your current To-Do app project and try and achieve this goal. So I hope you've given that a go and you're here just to check the solution. Now, remember, there's a lot of ways of doing the same thing. You can achieve exactly the same behavior using all sorts of different ways, and my solution is just one way of doing that. So the first thing we need to do is to, of course, go into our pubspec.yaml and to add our provider as a dependency. I'm going to do that right here. And then I'm going to get all my provider related files, and now I can use it. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new Dart file inside my models folder, and I'm going to call this task_data. So this is going to be the object that's going to be provided throughout my tree so that they can tap into the data of our tasks. This class is simply going to be called task_data, and it's again going to extend our ChangeNotifier class. Now, the reason why it's erroring out at the moment is because we need to be able to import the foundation.dart package, or we could import the material.dart package. But the material.dart package actually contains the foundation.dart package, so if you wanted to keep it light, then you can simply just use foundation.dart. And now we will be able to find ChangeNotifier inside foundation.dart, and we can use it to extend our task data class so that we can turn this class into something that other objects can listen to for changes and to update when we tell it to. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to import my other models class, which is my task.dart, and that, just a quick reminder, is basically the structure of a task object. And now if I go into my task screen.dart, I can find where currently my task data exists. It's inside this list of tasks inside my task screen state. So I'm going to lift that right out. So I'm going to cut it out of here and I'm going to move it over to my task data object. So it's going to be pasted inside here. It's going to be created exactly the same way. Tasks have a name, and by default, they're set to not done. So now I'm ready to provide this task property across my app. And I'm going to do that at the very top of my widget tree. So I'm going to do it inside the My App class. And I'm going to wrap everything that's inside my material app with this ChangeNotifier provider class. And of course, to be able to use it, I need to import my provider.dart package. So remember that provider has to be at a place in the tree that's high enough to be seen by the rest of the widgets that branch off later on. So in our case, that means putting it right at the top of the My App class. Now, if you only needed the data, say inside the task tile and nowhere else, then you might be able to go up one level to its parent and then wrap its parent, which is this task list, which of course lives right here. Then you could wrap that with a provider widget to be able to provide to all of its children. But if you get this wrong and you put this too low in the tree, then the children might not have access to it. Then you'll get errors when you run the app and try to do things telling you that it's not placed at the correct position in the widget tree. So take care where this goes. In our case, it needs to be above our material app. Now I'm getting a little warning here because there's a parameter called builder for the ChangeNotifier provider that's needed. So we saw this before. The builder takes the current context, so the current position inside the widget tree, and it returns the object that needs to be provided to all of the children in the tree. And that object is, of course, our newly created task data object. So let's go ahead and provide the task data object and also tell it about this task data object, which comes from the models folder, and it's called task data.dart. So now we have our ChangeNotifier provider at the very top of our widget tree, providing the task data object to all children below the tree that wants to listen for the data in there. Now we can actually read the data from here, namely the tasks list. So the first place where we might want to do that is actually on the task screen. Here where we have our task.length, which shows the user how many tasks they have remaining in their list. Well, this needs to be based on our task list. We need to count how many there are in here and provide it as a interpolated string right here. And we're getting an error right now because we removed tasks from our task screen state. Let's go ahead and remove task.length, and let's use what we learned previously where we tap into provider and we call the .of method. Now I'm going to get Android Studio to help me out with typing out the code, but first that means I have to import the provider.dart, and now I can tap into the .of method of provider, and of course always specify the data type in the of method, and it's going to be my task data object, which again we need to import. So we're going to tap into the models and we're going to tap into the task data.dart. Eventually, we're going to remove the need for the task.dart and to manage all of that related stuff inside task data. But for now, let's go ahead and tap into this object, which is going to be equivalent to our task data object now. And let's go into it to get hold of the tasks property. So let's write a .tasks, and then we're going to get the count or the length of that object, which currently should be equal to 3. So let's go ahead and hit save and try to get rid of the part where we have a Dart analysis error. So the first one is this part where we're adding tasks to our previous task list, which now doesn't exist. So of course it's undefined. So I'm actually going to go ahead and just comment out our set state. And in the next lesson, when we tackle how to add new tasks to our task data provider, then we'll figure this part out. So the other part is of course down here where we have our tasks being passed to our task list. Now this is of course the second place where we need to read from our task data.task property. But instead of passing it over and drilling through our tree, instead I'm simply going to go into our task list and get a hold of a reference to that task data object over here instead. So we actually don't need to pass anything over anymore. So we don't need these two things, and we don't need this reference to our task.dart either. But instead, I'm going to be importing our provider.dart and also our models folder, the task data.dart as well. And we're going to be using it inside our task list to build our list view. Now, right here, instead of using the widget.tasks, which taps into those properties passed into the task list stateful widget, instead, I'm simply just going to tap into the provider.of method. So instead of the widget.task at index.name, I'm going to replace widget.tasks with provider.of and specifying the data type, which is our task data. And then it's going to be provider.of task data .tasks at index.name. So I can copy this over and replace our widget in all of these places. And for now, I'm simply actually going to comment out our set state to handle what should happen when our checkbox gets checked. We're going to deal with that in a later lesson. But right now, all we want is just to be able to read the data that's inside the tasks inside our task data, which is being provided using our provider package. So now notice how we're not using that widget anymore, which comes from the stateful widget. So that's our way of accessing the properties that we deleted. And so we actually don't need this to be stateful even. We can actually turn it into a simpler stateless widget, and we can still get hold of the provider and get the data that we need, because we're no longer passing it over from our task screen via the constructor. So now notice how we also don't need state inside our task screen. So we can convert this to a stateless widget as well by deleting all of these lines and changing this to a stateless widget. And we can delete the unused import right up here as well. Now our app is actually a lot simpler because we have these memoryless stateless widgets, which simply get constructed when they're needed and destroyed and replaced with new ones when they update. So now we're tapping into the provider of our task data and getting hold of that list right here in order to populate our task tiles, and also we're using it inside our task screen to show how many tasks we have remaining. And this is just simply reading the tasks. Let's go ahead and hit save and run our app from scratch. And you can see that hopefully everything going well and all your code in the right places, we should have exactly the same user interface as we had before. But this time, this data is no longer being passed around, drilled down through the tree, and instead it's coming from our provider. So did you manage to get to this point when you tried to tackle it yourself? Well, there's a couple of things that we did, including creating our task data class that extends ChangeNotifier and wrapping our material app within a ChangeNotifier provider, which provides that task data object, and then finally using it by using the provider.of task data to tap into it both inside our task screen as well as our task list. That works right now, but we can actually make it a lot simpler. And we can do this through the use of something called a consumer widget that comes from our provider.dart as well. Because notice how we're using our provider.of task data dot tasks in 3 places here. It's getting a little bit repetitive, right? So instead of calling provider.of in 3 places, we can simply just wrap all of the downstream widgets that need to be updated when this tasks property changes inside what's called a consumer widget. So notice how we're using our provider.of inside our task tile, but we're also using it inside the item count. So if we go one level higher than that, well, then that's going to be our list view widget. So let's go ahead and wrap our list view widget inside a new widget, which is going to be our consumer widget. And this, of course, comes from the provider package. And in order to use it, we simply wrap any downstream widgets that need to be updated when a particular piece of data that we're listening to changes. And then we specify the data type, which is also going to be our task data. That's what we're listening for. And then it simply requires a builder. And the builder takes the current context, so where we are in the tree. In addition, it will be able to provide the current data. And we can give that object a name. So that is going to be our task data object. So I'm just simply going to call it task data. And that is going to be equivalent or basically the same as calling provider.of task data context. And finally, it also takes a property called a child. And now our builder is constructed and we can simply return any widgets that need to be built using this data. Instead of having a child property, I'm going to take this entire list view builder all the way down to the closing list view builder comment. And I'm going to cut it and then make sure I return it inside my consumer. And of course, because we're returning this widget, we have to add a semicolon here instead of a comma. So now we've gotten rid of all our errors, and instead of using provider.of blah, 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 we can replace all of that with just our task data. Let's go ahead and replace task data in all of these places where we have provider.of. And now what happens is that this consumer widget is going to be the one that's listening for changes in task data. So when task data updates its state, then it's going to rebuild this entire list view and update all the task tiles that have changed. So now our code is a lot more succinct, and we can even go one step further, because notice how right here we're using our task data.task.length. So we're getting the length of our list of tasks here, but we're also doing that right here, right? So usually when we're doing the same thing over and over again, then we should probably set up something to make it a little bit easier, a little bit more convenient the next time. So if we go into our task data, we can actually create a new integer which has a getter. So we use the get keyword to define this being a getter, and the getter is going to be something that returns a value. So this means that whenever somebody taps into the name of this property, this task count, then we're going to return a value that we calculate. And we're going to return this value based on our task list. So we're going to say tasks dot length. And now what happens is every time we try to tap into this task count property, well, it's going to compute the value of it by looking at our tasks, which is this list, and getting the length of that list. So now we can go into our task screen. Instead of calling provider of task.task.length, we can simply just simplify that to the task count. And we can, of course, do that inside our task list as well. So it will be task data dot task count. So we've now dramatically refactored our code, both through the use of a consumer widget, which can save us a lot of provider.ofs, and also we've managed to create a getter inside our task data to simplify the process of getting the length of our tasks list. Now, of course, you didn't need to do all of this to complete this challenge. All I wanted was to see that you could use the provider package to get hold of the data that we're providing through the use of a new object that uses and extends the ChangeNotifier, as well as wrapping our entire tree inside a ChangeNotifier provider to be able to provide this task data object, both inside the task screen, either using provider.of, or as we've seen now, we can also use the consumer widget as well. So that completes reading and exposing our provider. But in the next lesson, we're going to look at how we can add new tasks into our provider through the use of our ChangeNotifier. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson.